House and for consideration at committee.
Call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, it's always a pleasure to support good government legislation, and this is one of a few such examples. We in New Zealand First welcome the increase in penalties which are signalled by this bill, and we agree that there is a need for a clear and significant signal, strong deterrence. So beware the roastbusters and the others who are developing a culture of using the internet and other publications for illegal and indecent purposes. I welcome the provisions in the bill which clarify some of those offences and which widen the net to catch a greater range of the people who are involved. So New Zealand First welcomes the increases in penalties and the new offences which are specified in the bill. I will mention some of the most significant clauses. Clause 4 provides for an increase from 10 to 14 years imprisonment, a very significant deterrence for supplying or distributing objectionable material, doing so knowingly or having reasonable cause to believe that it's objectionable. This needs especially strong deterrence. Social effects of such materials are significant. They encourage sex with underage people, they encourage street prostitution, they encourage a culture of sexual abuse generally and target underage victims. Clause 5.3, which I quote and abridge as follows, says, "A person can have an electronic publication in that person's possession even though that person's actual or potential physical custody or control of the publication is not or does not include that person intentionally or knowingly using a computer or other electronic device to save the publication." This, Mr Speaker, solves some evidential problems and, as I've said, widens the net to catch more of the people involved. It especially means that proof of possession, where electronic means are used, will not be needed, and it will not be necessary for an offender to have proved to have saved an electronic document, and there will be no need to prove the intention to do so. This is appropriate and necessary, otherwise I think the evidential burden would be too severe. Possession per se should be enough, because electronic material clearly has to be searched or at least knowingly accepted. Otherwise, the offender could not have obtained it. Clause 6 amends Section 131A, which relates to offences of possession of objectionable publications and knowing or having reasonable cause to believe that the publications are objectionable. The maximum available penalty now is imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years or a fine not exceeding $50,000. The amendment increases that maximum from 5 to 10 years. But I think it should also say both, so that both penalties can be imposed, and I think the fine should be increased to at least $100,000, because some people do actually make quite a lot of money out of some of these activities. Clause 7 inserts a new Section 132B, which contains a presumption of imprisonment for repeat offenders who have been convicted of a specified publications offence committed after the commencement of the new section and before the conviction of the repeat offence, had the person been convicted of one or more specified publications offences committed before that commencement. In deciding whether such a publication is objectionable, the court must have had regard to the reasons in relevant classification office or board decisions. The offender must be sentenced for the repeat offence to a sentence of imprisonment unless the court considers the offender should not be sentenced, having regard to the circumstances of the repeat offence or the circumstances of the offender, including especially the age if he or she is under 20 years. And that's a very important provision. These new provisions are appropriate and necessary. They are needed to provide the tools required by which it will be possible to break the cycle of offending in these ways by people for whom such offending often becomes addictive, or for whom the financial rewards are too seductive. Concerning the amendments to Customs and Excise Act 1996, Clause 10.1 relates to being knowingly concerned in the importation, exportation or other unlawful transfer of an objectionable publication covering films, videos and other such documents. The amendment increases the maximum term of imprisonment from 5 years to 10 years. This is also supported by New Zealand First, because we think that a strong deterrence is needed for that. And again, some people make significant amounts of money out of these offences, so a strong deterrence is required. Concerning the amendments related to indecency in Part 2, Clause 13 creates a new offence, punishable by imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 years, of indecent communication with a young person under the age of 16 years. A person of or over the age of 16 years is liable to imprisonment if he or she intentionally exposes a person under the age of 16 years to indecent material. And that's whether it's written, spoken, visual or in any other way. And it occurs in communicating any matter directly or indirectly with the young person. In a prosecution, it's not necessary under the new provision to prove that the intentional exposure was for an identified purpose, such as to obtain sexual gratification or to alarm, distress or humiliate the victim, or the young person. But any identified purpose, rather, of that exposure may be considered in determining whether the material is indecent. New Zealand First welcomes this new offence, and 3 years prison will certainly cause an adjustment in attitudes. But New Zealand First does have some reservations about new Section 124A, subsection 2, which ensures that a reference in new Section 124A to a person under the age of 16 years includes a reference to a constable who pretends to be a person under the age of 16 years if the person charged, when communicating with the constable as such a young person and exposing the constable young person to indecent material, believed that the young person was a person under the age of 16 years. Now, Mr. Speaker, the problem here is that it raises rather too much of a risk of genuine cases of entrapment. And so this is a matter which I will be looking very closely at and discussing with my colleagues on the Justice and Electoral Committee, because there does need to be a balance between good legislation, as I've said, and some of the safeguards to personal rights which we all must be vigilant to protect. So we need to have a good look at that provision to see whether the balance is achieved. But, Mr. Speaker, overall, this is a good bill and it does deserve support to the Select Committee, so New Zealand First will be happy to vote for it.
I call Katrina Shanks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to take a